So if I started with a sort of definition of the absurd, if I started in what may feel like a really odd place in this particular reading, I have done so because I think that understanding that comparison aspect is very important before we really go back to the beginning, right? For us as beginners looking at the absurd, I think we need that point of comparison first before we go back and talk about some of these other kind of problematic, shocking, disturbing details that Camus presents in the Myth of Sisyphus. Camus begins his Myth of Sisyphus by talking about the philosophical problem of suicide, which is an incredibly triggering thing for a lot of us, right? Whose lives may have been affected by that. And again, right, this is some place where we do need to, take care of ourselves as we're looking at this particular idea. That's going to be very, very important to not ignore signs that we're starting to feel weird about this type of thing. Please do take care of yourselves with this, but understand as well that for Camus, the best way to illustrate this philosophy is to talk about this, right? And to say that for Camus, looking at the world, the place that he is in when he writes this piece, right? He writes the Myth of Sisyphus in just a moment. I have to find it, and I can never remember exactly where it is. It is slightly before, right? The he writes the plague. There we go. 1942. So he's in the middle of World War II, right? Revelations about what is happening in Germany are starting to become, somewhat apparent. It's apparent that World War II is not going the way anybody thought it was going to, that it's much worse. And so for Camus, talking about this idea of suicide and despair is something that is a fairly common thing at this point in time in history, right? Confrontation with a major world event that is going to really shape the way that Europe feels for decades. For at this point in time, 80 years past, the time when this is written, right? There is no less horror when talking about the Holocaust than there was when it was initially discovered, right? It's an absolutely history-altering event. And so Camus talking about the absurd starts from a place that is not where we, I believe, start thinking about the absurd. As I talked about in that first video, right, we think about the absurd and we think about comedy. We think about perhaps the lineup of cartoons that we currently have where, right, absurdity is part of the way that we like to examine comedy at this point in time. The more bizarre something is, right, the more some people really enjoy it, right? We watch a Wes Anderson film, for example, like the Grand Budapest Hotel or the most recent one, right, Asteroid City, and we look at it and we say, this is ridiculous. And it's in that comparison that I talked about in the first video that we find that ridiculous aspect of things, right? That, the fact that, an alien just comes down, takes an asteroid and goes away, and everybody's just sort of standing around being like, well, I guess that happened. That's absurd, right? And it's humorous. But when the humor is not there, that becomes, right, a more serious issue. So Camus brings up the idea of suicide. Is life worth living? I would say yes. So, right, again. But for Camus, he does actually eventually come to that conclusion. He comes to the conclusion that, yes, life is worth living, and that the best thing that we can do as people is to fight against the absurdity, against the despair, and become what he refers to as absurd heroes. The thing that Camus talks about at the very beginning is that people very rarely are killed for something other than what they consider to be fundamental beliefs, right? He says at the very beginning, I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument, right? Anything that is simply this fact or that fact, right? Which one is more correct, people will easily, when confronted with the idea of death, give it up, right? He says Galileo, who held a scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. The truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. We have in there a very important difference, right, that we will talk about as well. What is worth living for? What is worth dying for, right? When we talk about our beliefs, do we mean things that we simply hold to be true or things that we hold to be fundamental to our very existences, right? This has been a question for, centuries when it comes to religious beliefs, right? Some philosophical beliefs, sure, but especially we have seen religious beliefs leading people to, lay down their lives for a belief system, right, that they believe they cannot give up, or to, unfortunately, right, attack people and kill them for a belief system that they believe to be fundamentally wrong. Camus understands this, right? Does he agree necessarily with religion and with the religious wars? Absolutely not. I don't think he does. But he does say that this is a point at which the absurd kind of begins. What do we judge, worth living for? What do we judge worth dying for? And in the next part of this video, we're going to sort of talk about what he describes and how he describes things that are important, worth living for. We'll briefly dive back to that comparison idea, and then we will get to sort of the crux of the of this PDF, which is the myth of Sisyphus. Who is he? What does he judge worth living for? How can we consider him to be either happy or unhappy?